DE Recordigaler, my name is James Nagel, welcome to The Irish Nation Lives. As the Irish Civil War drew to a close, the soon-to-be victorious pro-treaty side set about formalising their split from Sinn Féin, and in April of 1923 they created a new party, Cumann, the Association of the Irish. Cumann was the name of a political party established by Arthur Griffith in 1900 and was later merged with the Dungannon clubs of Bulmer Hobson and Denis McCullagh to form Sinn Féin. So this was very much a homage to their dead leader and a declaration that they were moving away from that party's post-1916 Republican ideology. Throughout the 1920s, Cumann implemented and defended the key articles of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. They took Ireland's role in the Commonwealth seriously and attended the 3 imperial conferences that were held during their time in office. Professor John A. Murphy has described the various and often contradictory groups that found a home in Cumann after the Irish Civil War, united by little more than their opposition to a resurgent Sinn Féin. There were Michael Collins' stepping stone men, old Redmondites, former Unionists, and that wealthy middle-class Catholic elite that continues to wield power and influence when the smoke of revolution clears away. The refusal of Sinn Féin TDs to take their seats in Dáil Éireann effectively granted Cumann an absolute majority, which they used to introduce stringent public safety laws to combat the IRA. Though crippled by infighting and the immigration of many of its members, the IRA still posed a severe threat to the state. Throughout the 1920s they killed a number of Gardaí, and in 1927 they shot dead the Minister for Justice, Kevin O'Higgins. One of the most capable politicians to emerge from the recent conflict and a likely future party leader, O'Higgins' death was a massive blow to Cumann, and they responded with legislation aimed at damaging the abstentionist Republican parties, especially Fianna Fail, which had been founded by Éamon de Valera the previous year. Instead, this forced Fianna Fail to take their seats in Dáil Éireann, and almost led to the government's collapse. A general election in September of 1927 saw them hold on to power only with the aid of independents and some smaller parties. Support for Fianna Fail continued to grow as they put forward populist, protectionist economic policies and committed to undoing the most disagreeable aspects of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. They also declared that members of the army, still heavily staffed by pro-treaty Civil War veterans, would no longer be prioritised for state jobs on their retirement, and made statements which were interpreted as threatening army pensions. While Cumann were confident that their achievements over the previous decade would see them through, Fianna Fail was returned as the largest party at the general election in February of 1932 and were able to form a government with the support of Labour. Little over a week before these results, a meeting in Dublin saw the creation of the Army Comrades Association. A semi-benevolent association open to ex-members of the National Army, it declared itself to be non-political, but this stance didn't see out the year. In August, Dr. T.F. O'Higgins, the brother of the assassinated Minister for Justice and a Cumann TD in his own right, was elected as president. By the end of 1932, the Army Comrades Association was providing sizable bodyguards for Cumann speakers throughout the country, as attempts were made by the IRA to disrupt their meetings. Since coming to power, Fianna Fail had released IRA members held in prison and suspended much of the public safety legislation aimed against them. Emboldened by this, the IRA would call for the suppression of the Army Comrades Association, calling them Hitlerite and Free State traitors. Fianna Fail also began to attack the core tenets of the treaty, and the economic war, which began in August, undermined a decade of Cumann economic policy and hit their support base the hardest. Committed to defend free speech and oppose what O'Higgins perceived to be the growing threat of communism, the Army Comrades Association claimed a membership of 30,000 by the end of the year. While their defeat in 1932 obviously came as a disappointment, Cumann believed that the government would collapse within a year due to their inexperience and the negative impact of the economic war, finishing off Fianna Fail and de Valera once and for all. Indeed, with Labour wavering in its support, de Valera caught a snap general election after just 11 months, and in January of 1933, Ireland went to the polls again. At least 5 members of the Army Comrades Association contested the election for Cumann including O'Higgins and former ministers Richard Mulcahy and Ernest Bligh, and the association also protected party meetings from interference, engaging in fistfights with the IRA. The election, however, turned out to be a massive triumph for Fianna Fail. After nominating the Ceann Comhairle, they were just one seat short of an absolute majority, which they would win soon after in a by-election. Cumann Gael had been defeated in back-to-back general elections and had performed worse the second time around. De Valera now had the majority that he needed to undo the Anglo-Irish Treaty and prosecute the economic war. His lack of action on, indeed his tacit support for the IRA, and his party statements on National Army pensions raised genuine fears of persecution, while those who had fought in support of the treaty during the Civil War would now have to stand back and watch it torn apart by those they had defeated. After a decade in power, many in Cumann Gael were resentful of and unprepared for the opposition benches. This would culminate in a year of dramatic restructuring by the conservative, right-leaning and pro-treaty elements in Ireland as they attempted to adapt to the new political reality. First, a number of major changes occurred within the Army Comrades Association. In February, their objectives were updated as they became increasingly politicised, and in March, at a meeting of its executive, a decision was taken to adopt a shirt to be worn by all members. Ernest Bligh suggested that they use St. Patrick's blue, and while the organisation would undergo numerous name changes in future, it would be more commonly known as the Blueshirts. While it was argued that this was being done to create a sense of camaraderie amongst the members and to provide a uniform when guarding political meetings, there were parallels, which the Army Comrades Association rejected, to the shirted fascist movements which had come to prominence in Europe. Then, in May and June, the first approaches were made to General Eoin O'Duffy to take control of the Army Comrades Association. O'Duffy had served with distinction during the War of Independence and become Chief of Staff of the IRA in early 1922. During the Civil War, he was appointed by Michael Collins to serve with him and McCullagh on the War Council and took charge of the National Army in Munster, which saw some of the bloodiest fighting of the conflict. O'Duffy became Cumann Gael's go-to man in times of crisis. Following a mutiny in the Civic Guard, he was appointed Commissioner of An Garda Síochána, and after a mutiny in the Army in 1924, he was briefly appointed Chief of Staff to carry out an inquiry. After taking office, De Valera was put under tremendous pressure by those in his party to remove O'Duffy as Garda Commissioner, but he wasn't in a position to do so until after the 1933 election. In February, O'Duffy was offered an alternative position in the civil service to make way for Fianna Fáil's preferred commissioner. Regarding this as a humiliating demotion, he refused and resigned. This bolstered his reputation as a tireless and devoted servant of the Irish nation, hounded from public service by a corrupt government, and strengthened the belief that Fianna Fáil was about to begin a purge of the National Army and those who had supported the treaty. After discussions, O'Duffy accepted leadership of the Army Comrades Association on the condition that a number of changes were made, and following his appointment on the 20th of July 1933, the organisation was renamed the National Guard. Membership was open to those who had not served in the army, and a new constitution was introduced, setting out the reunion of Ireland, opposition to communism, and the exposure of government corruption as its key aims. It also made reference to a number of corporatist proposals associated with a papal encyclical issued by Pius XI in 1931, though they also mirrored the policies then in place in Mussolini's Italy. The Army Comrades Association had already adopted the right-hand Roman salute when greeting their leaders, and to this was now added the cry, "Hoc O'Duffy." Within days of taking the leadership of the National Guard, O'Duffy announced that, on the 13th of August, he would lead a parade of up to 20,000 Blueshirts to the monument on the grounds of Dáil Éireann dedicated to Michael Collins, Arthur Griffith and Kevin O'Higgins. Intended or not, this stirred up comparisons to Mussolini's March on Rome, when he had seized power through a mass demonstration in 1922. O'Duffy also began to make increasingly extremist speeches, denouncing the parliamentary system as an English construct which would need to be remodelled on corporatist and vocational lines, and stating that political parties had outlived their usefulness. The IRA declared that they would attack the Blueshirt March. Weapons held legally by prominent Blueshirts were seized by the Gardaí, and by the 6th of August, 300 heavily armed members of the force were on duty at government buildings. On the day before the parade was to take place, the government banned it under Article 2A of the Free State Constitution, legislation which they themselves had opposed when they were in opposition. While O'Duffy called off the parade later that evening, further legislation was used on the 21st of August to proclaim the National Guard as an illegal organisation. In the midst of all this, discussions had been taking place about a proposed merger between Fine Gael and the National Centre Party. There was a growing realisation that a united opposition would be needed to combat Fianna Fail, but there was a problem. Who would lead that opposition? Having overseen their two recent electoral defeats, sections within Fine Gael had grown dismissive of W.T. Cosgrave, while the National Centre Party also favoured a change of leadership. O'Duffy's altercations with the government elevated him to even greater standing in the eyes of those opposed to Fianna Fail, and a joint delegation of the parties met with him at the end of August, asking him to bring the National Guard into the merger and accept the leadership of the movement. And so, on the 8th of September 1933, Eoin O'Duffy was announced as president of the United Ireland Party, Fine Gael. It was made clear that the National Guard would continue on within, but separate from, this new party, and the following day it was reconstituted as the Young Ireland Association in an attempt to circumvent the government ban. Later in the month, some Fine Gael TDs started to wear their blue shirt uniforms in Dáil Éireann, drawing the ire of the government benches, and there was a nationwide escalation in violence involving the Blueshirts. The army had to be deployed during riots in Clare and Cork in September, and on the 6th of October, at a meeting in Tralee, O'Duffy was struck in the head with a hammer. He began to encourage farmers to withhold paying land annuities to the government in protest over the economic war, a measure opposed by the wider Fine Gael party as it entailed breaking the law. Gardaí were sent to seize the cattle of farmers who could not or would not pay, and attempts to sell them at public auction to make the money back were attacked and disrupted by the Blueshirts. Members would swarm the auction from neighbouring areas, necessitating a large and expensive Garda presence to maintain order, which often far outweighed the revenue generated by the sale of the cattle. The government, however, could not be seen to step down in the face of violent opposition, and so the costly seizures continued, as did battles between the Gardaí and the Blueshirts. The government was determined to crack down on them, and in December the Young Ireland Association was declared to be illegal, as it was nothing more than the banned National Guard under a different name. At an emergency meeting of the Fine Gael executive, a pretence was made of dissolving the association and creating a brand new one, the League of Youth, with O'Duffy again as Director General. In January of 1934, O'Duffy won a number of major victories over the government, successfully challenging the legality of his recent arrest and attempts to try him by military tribunal. The government struck back with a bill aimed at outlawing the wearing of uniforms and drew comparisons between the Blueshirts and the shirted fascist movements which had seized power in Europe. Fine Gael saw the bill as an attack on free speech, and John A. Costello declared it to be the culmination of the illegal activities of the government over the past 6 months. After a series of wild and bitter debates, the bill was passed in all stages by the Dáil, but was rejected by the Senate in March. This meant that the bill would be delayed from coming into law for 18 months, rendering it useless in the government's campaign against the Blueshirts. These victories over the government represented the high point of O'Duffy's leadership of Fine Gael and were a considerable boost to the party, with local council elections approaching in June. O'Duffy attracted large and enthusiastic crowds as he campaigned the length and breadth of the country. Confident of a major victory, he declared on the eve of the local elections that Fine Gael would emerge as the largest party and secure control of 20 of the 23 councils being contested. Instead, they won 7. With the remainder taken by a Fianna Fail Labour coalition. While it wasn't a terrible result, it was a major setback for O'Duffy, and it saw the Blueshirt movement lose momentum. The political system had failed him, and there followed a dramatic rise in violence related to the land annuities, as well as a return to the more extremist rhetoric which he had rolled back on since becoming president of Fine Gael. In August, a group of Blueshirts drove a lorry through the gates of a yard in Cork where a cattle auction was about to start. Armed Gardaí opened fire, killing Michael Lynch. While he wasn't the first Blueshirt to die, his funeral was turned into a propaganda spectacle, with O'Duffy delivering the graveside oration. The same month, the Minister for Justice, P.J. Rutledge, read in the Dáil some statements that had been made by Blueshirts at meetings around the country. Commandant Ned Cronin had told a crowd in Tipperary, "If a dictatorship is necessary for the Irish people, we are going to have one," while Captain Quish, referencing the Irish Revolution, declared in Limerick, "We used guns before. The government are a crowd of Spaniards, Jews and Manxmen. If necessary, we will use the guns again to redeem the people." On the 18th and 19th of August 1934, the first Blueshirt Congress convened in Dublin. O'Duffy spoke of Fine Gael's corporate policy, which the Blueshirts had introduced to them, declaring it to be the chief plank in the policy of Fine Gael for the rehabilitation of Ireland. The 1,000 delegates in attendance enthusiastically endorsed a resolution to be put before the Fine Gael executive 11 days later, calling on farmers throughout the country not to pay the land annuities. This was an open call for the party to approve breaking the law in the Blueshirts' fight against the government, and stood in stark contradiction to the values established by Cumann Gael. At that executive meeting on the 30th, one of the party's vice presidents, Professor James Hogan, resigned as a protest against the resolution and what he described as O'Duffy's generally destructive and hysterical leadership. While O'Duffy withdrew the resolution to maintain party unity, a series of leadership conferences were held in the weeks ahead. Speeches he had made supporting the declaration of a republic and committing the Blueshirts to an invasion of Northern Ireland came in for severe criticism. O'Duffy was called on to accept a number of proposals, that in future his speeches would be delivered only from prepared and approved manuscripts, and that interviews to the press were to be given only after consultation with members of Fine Gael and were only to be given in writing. O'Duffy seemed to accept these constraints, but, without warning, at the next executive meeting on the 21st of September 1934, he resigned as president of Fine Gael. As you can imagine, the story doesn't just end here, but, for all intents and purposes, I've covered enough for this episode. The Blueshirts are left to slowly fall apart in the years ahead. Agreements between the British and Irish governments de-escalating the economic war allowed them to claim that they had fulfilled their mission and were no longer needed. Though it had long since fallen apart, the organisation limped on until October of 1937, when Fine Gael locked its headquarters and told its last Director General that they would no longer cover the organisation's debts. As for O'Duffy, after leaving Fine Gael, his politics became increasingly more extreme and less popular. In December 1934, he attended the International Fascist Congress in Switzerland, and the following year he set up the National Corporate Party. For a movement that may have counted over 40,000 members at its peak, less than 100 Blueshirts joined him. On the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, O'Duffy attempted to raise a force to travel and fight alongside Francisco Franco. While he received interest from over 6,000 men, poor organisation on his behalf meant that only 700 or so ever travelled from Ireland. They made little of a contribution and suffered more casualties from friendly fire and disease than they did from engagements with the Republicans. O'Duffy will appear on the fringes of later episodes, trying to establish another political party, trying to gather support from the IRA and liaising with German spies. But after departing from Fine Gael, he would never again have a major impact on Irish affairs. If we look at the events of this period, we can see that the Blueshirts and Fine Gael were created in response to the rise of Fianna Fail and their election to office in 1932. There were genuine fears that Fianna Fail was under IRA control and that they would seek revenge for their defeat in the Civil War. The Blueshirts saw attacks on Cumann Gael meetings as a concentrated attempt by Valera and the IRA to destroy free speech, and they drew their membership heavily from ex-servicemen who felt persecuted for their stance on the treaty. Following the 1933 general election, there was an agreement by the forces aligned against De Valera that they would need to unite if they ever wished to get him out of office. This welded Cumann Gael, a party committed to law and order, to the Blueshirts, who were moving increasingly towards direct action. Though he was an exciting and charismatic figurehead, Eoin O'Duffy proved to be an incompetent and indiscreet leader, talking himself into corners by professing his admiration for Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, leaving the wider Fine Gael party open to accusations of fascism. The violent tactics of the Blueshirts brought them into conflict with the majority of the party, while O'Duffy's erratic pronouncements embarrassed those who had to sit in Dáil Éireann and suffer attacks from the government benches that they were preparing an assault on the democratic system. Historian Mike Cronin summed up the uneasy alliance by stating that the politically bankrupt forces of Cumann and the Centre Party were impotent because of their failure to deal with De Valera. They had to stand behind O'Duffy in the coalition and hope that he would resurrect their fortunes without destroying them in the process. Eventually, he would destroy himself, and Cosgrave would re-emerge to lead Fine Gael as they quietly airbrushed Eoin O'Duffy out of the party's history. Finally, here's an interesting question. Were the Blueshirts fascist? You might think there's a pretty obvious answer to this, but some historians dismiss any links between the Blueshirts and fascism, claiming that they were inspired solely by Roman Catholic teachings on the corporate state, or that their members joined out of fear and the damage caused to them by the economic war. The most widely agreed position is that the Blueshirts were para-fascist. No matter what outward symbols of fascism they adopt, a para-fascist entity is one that feels threatened by real fascism. When O'Duffy attempted to get Fine Gael approval for unconstitutional direct action, men who would have been expected to support him, such as McCullagh and Bligh, who had introduced the blue shirt in the first place, did not do so. They and others opposed and felt threatened by the course of action O'Duffy was taking and reined him in. When he left, there were no attempts to get him to return, and very few followed him. The truth is, we will never know what the Blueshirts would have become if they had gained power in Ireland. How fascist any one group was, or why the ideology ultimately failed to gain many adherents here, is well beyond the remit of this episode, and if time allows, it is something that I might look at in future. Following the election of Fianna Fail, the conservative pro-treaty elements restructured out of fear and for their own survival. They threw everything they could at De Valera, from a united opposition to an extra-parliamentary shirted movement, and nothing worked. De Valera would remain in power until 1948, to be removed only by an unstable five-party coalition. His party, his dismantling of the treaty, and his economic policies had widespread popular support. But why? In the next episode covering the events leading up to the emergency, I'll take a look at answering that question and examine the economic war. This has been a brief and incomplete look at what is a very complex topic, and what I had to leave out would easily have filled another episode. The main aim was to discuss the opposition to Fianna Fail in the 30s, how they were forced to reform, and the odd direction that some of that opposition briefly took. As descendants of Cumann Gael, which defended the treaty and respected Ireland's place in the Commonwealth, Fine Gael attracted those who would argue for Irish involvement in the Second World War on the Allied side. Throughout the 1930s and during the war itself, the isolationist and neutral policies of Fianna Fail were returned with large majorities at successive elections. In later episodes, we will look at why the Irish people supported these policies, but for now, I have to go and read up on trade surpluses. A Horda. Thank you for joining me on The Irish Nation Lives. Slán go fóill.